Senator, another major thing pending up on Capitol Hill is voting rights, with bills kicking around. I think the Senate may be considering one even today. And that's specific to Georgia because to some extent, some changes in the state laws in Georgia triggered a lot of this reaction, I believe, as well as then later Texas. And let's be personal. I mean, it really might have affected your election as well. I wonder, would you have gotten elected if the current law were the law when you had your election?
Well, the reason that Republican state legislators in Georgia enacted that law, SB 202, was to try to gain some partisan advantage. They cut the early vote period for runoff elections. They made voting by mail much more arduous. They've allowed partisan state officials to take over local election authorities if they so choose. And I think it's imperative that we pass strong federal voting rights legislation that ends voter suppression, that restores the pre-clearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act. You know, it used to be a bipartisan issue, reauthorizing the Voting Rights Act in full. Right now, we're even having difficulty getting any Republicans to express support for full reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. So I'm going to continue to work with colleagues like Senator Reverend Warnock from Georgia, Senator Klobuchar, who chairs the Rules Committee, which oversees election administration, Senator Manchin, to try to hammer out some legislation that can pass the United States Senate, and I'm willing to keep talking to Republican colleagues to get that done as well. You
mentioned your colleague, Joe Manchin, who has his own alternative approach, as I understand it, which would nationalize a lot of these issues, take care of them, also include voter ID, which some people would object to. He's trying to get that to be bipartisan. Are you open to things like voter ID if, in fact, they correct some of the other issues like early voting?
Absolutely. I think it's right and appropriate, and the widely held view of folks in Georgia and across the country, that we need to be able to make sure we're confirming the identity of folks who are participating in elections. And Senator Manchin's counter-proposal last week outlining his vision for voting rights legislation was welcome. That's a constructive part of this process. We're going to have some votes this week on this matter, but the conversation is going to continue. And here's the bottom line. Voter suppression, partisan takeovers of local election boards should not be permitted. Congress has clear authority under Article 1, Section 4 to regulate how federal elections are handled to ensure that they're fair and secure and that every eligible American voter can participate in this process. So we need to pass federal voting rights guarantees and restore the Voting Rights Act in full.
I'm going to impose on you just one last time, Senator, because I had a viewer actually write in while you were talking and ask, what specifically do you object to most in the new Georgia law? Well, if you had to name one thing that you thought really did go to voter suppression, what would it be?
Well, the state legislature has made it much more arduous to participate in elections voting by mail while not presenting a shred of evidence that there was any illegitimate use of vote by mail in the 2020 election. They've cut the early voting period in runoff elections in half. Early voting is overwhelmingly used by Democratic-supporting voters. And as you know, as I know, I just ran a runoff election in Georgia. These top-of-ticket races in Georgia are likely to go to runoffs. And they've also empowered partisan state officials to take over local election boards. That's very dangerous, especially when you have, as we just had, an outgoing president of the United States who was applying all of this political pressure and threats of criminal prosecution targeting Georgia's Republican Secretary of State unless he overturned the legitimate result of the election, unless he overturned the will of the people in Georgia. These are dangerous provisions in law. A federal response is warranted. Congress has the constitutional authority to pass voting rights measures, and we should.